The air was thick with anticipation as students shuffled through the grand, oak-carved doors of Havenbrook Academy's long-forgotten ballroom. This year's Halloween celebration was destined to be different, a revival of a legendary event whispered about in the school's shadowed halls, an event that had been abandoned for 50 years. No one really knew why. Some said the last Halloween dance had ended in tragedy. Others believed it was mere superstition, yet no one could explain why the ballroom had remained sealed, untouched by time. The towering, arched windows, dusty from years of neglect, gleamed faintly as the last remnants of twilight faded into night. Streamers, orange and black, clung to the walls like cobwebs, while the large crystal chandelier above hung ominously, casting flickers of dim light across the expansive room. The students, clad in elaborate costumes, twirled and mingled, their laughter echoing eerily through the chamber. At the center of it all stood Daniel Whitlock, a senior with a skeptical mind and little interest in ghost stories. He was only there because of his friends, their eager faces plastered with excitement as they spoke about the rumors of the dance. They talked about the disappearance 50 years ago, how every student and teacher present had vanished without a trace. Of course, Daniel didn't believe any of it. To him, it was just another Halloween story meant to scare freshmen. But as the night progressed, something gnawed at Daniel's nerves. The air in the ballroom grew colder, and the once lively chatter seemed distant, as though the room itself were swallowing the sound. He glanced around, uneasy. His friends were laughing, spinning in the rhythmic sway of the dance, but something was wrong, very wrong. The music had begun to change. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight alteration in tempo. But soon, it became clear. The light, festive melody was slowing, morphing into something darker, a haunting waltz that filled the room with a sense of dread. Daniel's heart quickened as he realized the source of his discomfort. His feet were moving, without his control. He wasn't the only one. Every student, every dancer, seemed bound to the rhythm, their movements synchronized with the eerie tune. Eyes wide with confusion, they tried to stop, but their bodies refused to obey. The once joyful Halloween dance had become something else, something sinister. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He tugged at his legs, his arms, but the invisible force gripping him was relentless. The floor beneath him began to shift, the polished wood taking on a strange, almost liquid sheen. Panic gripped him as he saw the edges of the room start to blur, the walls warping, bending into shapes that shouldn't be possible. The chandelier above dimmed, its light flickering out until the only illumination came from the dimly glowing floor beneath their feet. Suddenly, a scream cut through the air, sharp and unnatural. Daniel turned, his gaze locking onto one of his classmates, a girl dressed as a vampire, her face twisted in horror as she was lifted off the ground, her feet still dancing in midair. Her scream was swallowed by the haunting melody, and then she was gone, faded into the dark, as if she had never existed. The room was changing, the walls melting away to reveal something far more terrifying. Shadowy figures, their faces gaunt and hollow, emerged from the darkness. Dressed in old-fashioned gowns and suits, their eyes empty, they glided toward the dancers, their movements unnaturally smooth. These were not the students of Havenbrook. They were something else. Something from the past. Daniel's heart sank as realization dawned on him. The lost souls of the last Halloween dance had returned. The ballroom had become a tomb of lost time, a place suspended between the present and the forgotten past. Daniel could feel it in the air, something ancient, something far older than the legends of Havenbrook Academy. His pulse quickened as the shadows deepened around him, the air thick with the scent of decay and age. The spectral figures that had appeared from the corners of the room now moved closer, their vacant eyes locked onto the students who still twirled in the cursed dance, oblivious to the growing horror. The melody, once festive and light, now oozed with malevolence, each note vibrating with an unearthly resonance. Daniel struggled against the unseen force that controlled his limbs, his feet gliding across the floor in grotesque harmony with the haunting waltz. It was as if the music itself had taken possession of him, of all of them. His mind screamed for freedom, yet his body moved of its own accord. As the spectral figures drifted nearer, Daniel's gaze fixed on their hollow faces, faces that seemed to flicker and dissolve in and out of existence. They wore the tattered remains of the formal attire from another era, ball gowns shredded by time, tuxedos hanging loosely from skeletal frames. Their eyes, or what remained of them, were like black voids, endless and consuming. One of the figures, a tall, gaunt man with a wide, empty smile, floated directly toward Daniel, its bony hands outstretched, fingers curled like talons. A shiver crawled down Daniel's spine as the figure passed through him. Cold, an indescribable cold, pierced his very soul, leaving him breathless. For a moment, he glimpsed something beyond the physical world, a vision of a void filled with writhing, formless shapes, ancient things that squirmed in the dark, their grotesque forms twisting in rhythms beyond human comprehension. His mind reeled, threatening to break under the weight of the sight. The figure moved on, disappearing into the mist that had begun to creep through the ballroom, its swirling tendrils obscuring the floor and rising to mid-thigh. The room was transforming into something unrecognizable, a place where the walls themselves seemed alive, pulsing with an alien energy. The grand windows, once offering a view of the dark and outside world, were now opaque, as if the night itself had sealed them from within. It was then that Daniel saw it, the stage. At the far end of the ballroom, where the band had once played, a tall, looming figure stood, cloaked in shadows deeper than night. It was not human, or at least not anymore. Its form was vague, shifting in and out of sight, as though reality itself rejected its presence. Long, sinewy arms hung at its sides, the claws at the ends of its fingers tapping rhythmically against its shrouded form, in perfect time with the cursed music. The creature, whatever it was conducting the dance. And it was feeding. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched one of the students, a boy dressed in a cheap pirate costume, collapse to the ground. His face was pale, his eyes wide open in horror, yet still unseeing. His chest heaved, as if trying to draw breath, but no air came. He convulsed once, twice, and then his body went still, his face locked in a rictus of terror. The shadowy dancers swept around him, indifferent to the death in their midst. And the music played on, relentless, merciless. This was no ordinary haunting. This was a ritual. A grotesque, cosmic ritual that had begun 50 years ago and had never truly ended. The dancers, both living and dead, were the fuel, and the thing on the stage was the conductor, drawing power from the souls it ensnared. The lost students of that long-ago Halloween were still here, trapped in this endless night, their bodies long gone but their spirits bound to the dance, forever part of the hideous symphony. Despair clawed at Daniel's mind, but amidst the swirling fog and the sound of the infernal music, a fragment of his will remained intact. He had to find a way to break the spell, to stop the dance before it claimed them all. But how? The music was inescapable, and the thing on the stage seemed to be the source, or at least the master of this madness. His mind raced, searching for any explanation, any possible way to disrupt the malevolent energy that controlled the ballroom. And then, amidst the growing terror, a memory surfaced. A passage he had read long ago, buried in the pages of an ancient book. It spoke of rituals, of entities that existed beyond the veil of reality, creatures that feasted on human life and fed on the souls of the living. These beings, though powerful, were bound by laws older than time itself. If he could find a way to disrupt the music, to break the spell, perhaps they could escape. But the clock was ticking. The creature on the stage shifted again, its movements growing more frenzied, more urgent, as though the energy it was drawing from the dancers was reaching a climax. The air around Daniel grew thick with dread, the sensation that something was watching, waiting for the final note of the waltz to play and claim them all. The last Halloween dance had only just begun. The music throbbed in Daniel's skull, an insidious rhythm that burrowed into his consciousness like the whispering of ancient, unknowable things. He could feel it in his veins now, pulsing alongside his heartbeat, threatening to drown his mind in madness. Around him, the other students moved like puppets on invisible strings, their faces slack with fear but unable to stop their bodies from swaying, spinning, stepping to the cursed waltz. Every glance he cast at his classmates only deepened his sense of horror. They were not just dancing. They were fading. As the moments dragged on, their features grew paler, more translucent. It was as if the life was being drained from them with every step, siphoned off into the void. And the thing on the stage, Daniel's gaze drifted back to it with a sickening realization. It was growing stronger. Its form, once indistinct and nebulous, was becoming more defined, solidifying with every soul it claimed. Daniel's thoughts were frantic, racing in chaotic spirals, trying to piece together a way out of this nightmare. But the more he tried to think, the more the music drowned out his reason, a relentless tide of noise that gnawed at his sanity. He knew that if he didn't act soon, he would be lost like the others, another ghost in the eternal dance. Then, through the fog of his mind, a memory returned, Havenbrook Academy's long history, older even than the town itself. The building had been constructed on the ruins of something far older, something the locals had never spoken of openly. Daniel had once stumbled upon a dusty old tome in the Academy's library, a book of local folklore and forgotten horrors, filled with cryptic references to ancient rites and cursed places. One passage, in particular, stood out in his mind now, the forgotten conductor, a being whose name was never written, only whispered. A being that enslaved souls through its music, trapping them in an endless dance of death. Could that be what this was? Could the thing on the stage be the very same creature from the old legend? Daniel felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. If the story was true, then the only way to stop the ritual was to break the music. But how could he silence something so unearthly, so woven into the very fabric of the room itself? The fog thickened around him, curling like tendrils of mist through the ballroom, coiling around his legs and dragging him deeper into the abyss of the dance. His limbs ached, his muscles screaming for release as they moved without his control, locked into the rhythm of the cursed waltz. His eyes darted across the room, searching for anything, any sign of escape, any object that could sever this invisible grip on them all. The figures of the long-dead dancers were closer now, their hollow, black eyes staring with a hunger that transcended death. Their bodies shimmered, flickering between solidity and shadow, as if they were caught between two worlds, the living and the dead. Daniel could see the faces of his classmates mirrored in those specters, a chilling glimpse of their inevitable fate. And above them all, the conductor loomed, its form now fully solid, a grotesque amalgamation of rotting flesh and ethereal darkness. Its eyes, dark pits of unfathomable depth, fixed on Daniel. A low, guttural sound emanated from it, something that might have been a laugh in another time, another reality. It raised one of its skeletal arms, and with a single flick of its clawed hand, the tempo of the music quickened. The students' movements became frantic, jerky, as if their very bodies were breaking under the strain of the dance. Their faces contorted in silent screams, but no sound escaped their lips, only the relentless, maddening music filled the air. Desperation clawed at Daniel's throat. He had to act now, or he would be claimed like the rest. And then, through the swirling chaos, he saw it. On the far side of the ballroom, half hidden in the shadows, stood the grand piano. It was old, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, untouched for decades. But something about it called to him, a faint glimmer of hope. The piano was not playing. It was the only source of silence in the room, a stark contrast to the demonic melody that reverberated from nowhere. If there was any chance of breaking the spell, it had to lie with that instrument. With all his remaining strength, Daniel fought against the invisible force driving his limbs. His body resisted, every muscle burning with the effort, but he managed to stumble forward, each step a battle against the crushing weight of the music. His vision blurred, the edges of the room warping and twisting in impossible shapes, but he fixed his eyes on the piano, his only beacon of salvation. As he drew closer, the air around him grew heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere were trying to suffocate him. The conductor's gaze followed his every move, and the specters of the dead dancers seemed to close in around him, their bony hands reaching out, eager to claim him. But Daniel pressed on, his will a fragile but burning flame in the overwhelming darkness. Finally, he reached the piano, his hands trembling as they hovered above the yellowed keys. His fingers were numb, his mind teetering on the brink of madness, but he knew that this was the only way. He had to disrupt the music, break the spell, before the dance consumed them all. With a final, desperate breath, Daniel slammed his hands down on the piano keys. The sound that erupted from the piano was not a chord, not a melody, but a discordant crash, a jarring explosion of noise that cut through the cursed waltz like a blade through flesh. The ballroom froze. The music stopped, and the conductor turned its gaze upon Daniel. For a moment, the world seemed to hang in suspended horror. The discordant crash of the piano echoed through the vast, decaying ballroom, lingering in the air like the toll of some infernal bell. Daniel's fingers, still trembling, remained splayed over the keys, though his mind screamed for them to move. The silence that followed was profound, an unnatural quiet, thick and suffocating. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn, leaving an abyss where sound and light once lived. The dancers, both the living and the dead, stood frozen in mid-step, their ghastly forms no longer moving, but their eyes were wide and fixated on him. Hundreds of eyes, hollow, black, and glimmering with something ancient, stared with unblinking intensity, as if waiting for some inevitable judgment. The spectral figures of the past, once swirling in the cursed dance, now hovered eerily in the shadows, their translucent bodies slowly dissolving into the walls. Yet, in that silent void, Daniel felt no relief. The true horror was yet to come. The conductor, an abomination that defied all rationality, moved. It did not walk, it did not glide, it shifted, as though reality itself bent to its will. Where it passed, the air thickened with rot, and the walls groaned as if they, too, feared the entity's presence. Its form, a grotesque amalgamation of decayed flesh and swirling void, grew more defined with every step it took toward Daniel. Its face, or what could be called a face, was a nightmarish visage of hollow eye sockets and cracked, leathery skin, barely holding together its formless mass. The unnatural silence persisted, but Daniel could feel the weight of its gaze bearing down upon him, an ancient, malevolent force whose origins stretched beyond the limits of human understanding. He could sense it reaching into his mind, prying at the edges of his sanity, twisting his thoughts into dark and incomprehensible shapes. The cursed waltz, he realized, had not merely been music. It had been a call, an invocation for something far more insidious than the dead souls trapped in the dance. The conductor halted, looming over Daniel, its clawed hands now fully materialized, dripping with a black, tar-like substance that oozed onto the floor in hissing pools. The ballroom seemed to ripple with its presence, like the surface of some nightmarish lake, where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin as smoke. And then, without warning, the silence broke. Foolish mortal, the voice was not heard with ears, but felt within Daniel's mind, deep, resonant, and suffocating. It was as if the very foundations of the universe were speaking, and the weight of that voice threatened to crush him. Did you think you could stop what has been written in the stars, what has been etched into the bones of time itself? Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps, but no words formed in his throat. The entity was beyond anything he had ever imagined, beyond ghost, beyond demon. It was primordial, a thing birthed in the cold, empty expanse before the dawn of man. His hands, still gripping the keys of the piano, were numb, his mind lost in a whirlwind of incomprehensible terror. "You have awakened it," the voice continued, darker, more insidious now. "You have played the final note in the grand symphony of the abyss. The dance shall never cease, not until the stars themselves fall from the sky." As the conductor's words slithered through his consciousness, Daniel's eyes were drawn to the other students in the ballroom. They were no longer fading, but they were not themselves either. Their once human forms were now contorted, twisted into ghastly parodies of their former selves. Faces stretched impossibly long, limbs bent at unnatural angles. Their eyes, once wide with fear, now reflected only the infinite void, the same void that pulsed within the conductor. The music had not truly stopped. It had simply changed. A sickening realization struck Daniel like a blow to the chest. The discordant noise he had created, the piano's cacophony of broken notes, it had not freed them from the waltz. It had completed it. His desperate attempt to break the spell had instead cemented their doom. The walls of the ballroom began to shift, the once solid stone twisting and warping, bending outward as if the entire building was being consumed by the darkness. The floor beneath Daniel's feet trembled, vibrating with an unnatural rhythm. It was as though the very foundations of Havenbrook Academy were coming undone, being swallowed by the abyss that had been summoned by the cursed dance. In his peripheral vision, Daniel could see the walls dissolve, revealing endless, starless voids beyond, where the forms of ancient and forgotten horrors writhed in the blackness. The shadows within those voids were alive, whispering ancient secrets in tongues that had no name, secrets that clawed at his sanity with every syllable. The conductor raised its hand, and with it, the ballroom seemed to breathe, the very air trembling with malevolent anticipation. "Dance," it whispered, the command vibrating through Daniel's soul. "Dance until the end of time." And with that, the music returned, louder, more chaotic, and filled with the screams of those lost to the abyss. The students, the things that were once students, began to move again, their twisted forms jerking and spinning to the insane rhythm, their faces locked in grotesque masks of eternal torment. Daniel's legs moved without his consent, his body no longer his own. The ballroom shifted around him, stretching into infinity, an endless space where time and reason no longer held meaning. The conductor's laughter echoed through the hall, a deep, guttural sound that resonated with the very core of existence itself. And as Daniel's body was dragged into the unholy dance, his mind slipped further into the abyss, consumed by the horrors that writhed just beyond the veil of reality. He was no longer a man. He was a part of the dance now. Forever. The ballroom had ceased to be a room in any conventional sense. It had become a vast, shifting nightmare of impossible architecture, stretching and twisting into a horizon of madness. The floor beneath Daniel's feet buckled like the surface of a dark ocean, waves of shadow lapping against his legs as if eager to pull him under. Columns that once stood tall now warped and coiled like serpentine creatures, disappearing into the oppressive darkness above, where the ceiling should have been, but now only a yawning abyss remained. The other students, trapped in the same grotesque waltz, moved with the unnatural precision of marionettes. Their faces, once familiar, now deformed into monstrous caricatures, contorted in expressions of sheer terror and torment, though their bodies twirled with a sickening grace. Their limbs, impossibly long and thin, moved in ways that no human joints could bear. And their eyes, those vacant, hollow pits, never strayed from Daniel, as if they, too, knew that he had sealed their fate. The music pounded in his ears, louder, more insistent, a cacophony that threatened to rupture his very skull. But there was no escaping it. His body betrayed him, his legs moving in time to the twisted rhythm, his feet gliding across the warped, undulating floor. His mind screamed in protest, but it was a distant cry, drowned out by the ancient, malevolent force that had taken hold of him. The conductor stood at the center of this madness, a towering figure that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. Its grotesque form had fully solidified, and now, under the dim, flickering light of phantom chandeliers, Daniel could see its true horror. The creature was a mass of rotting flesh, twisted sinew, and gaping voids where features should have been. Its arms, long and grotesquely jointed, waved in time with the music, conducting the symphony of horror that had consumed them all. It watched him. He felt its gaze upon him, not with eyes, but with something far worse, an awareness, an intelligence that transcended time and space, something ancient and unfathomable that had slumbered beneath the surface of reality, now awakened and feeding on the souls of the living. A guttural whisper slithered into Daniel's mind, bypassing his ears, burrowing deep into his thoughts. You are part of the dance, mortal. You and all the others. Forever. A tremor of realization ran through him, but it was futile. He had no control, no will left to resist. His legs moved without command, his body a prisoner of the infernal waltz. The ballroom itself was alive now, a breathing entity, pulsating in time with the music, its walls rippling with dark, oily shadows that seemed to watch them all with malicious glee. And beyond those walls, beyond the boundaries of the physical, something darker awaited. Something infinite. The air grew thick, almost tangible, as though the space around them had become viscous, dragging them deeper into the nightmare. Daniel's breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps, his chest heaving under the weight of unseen forces. His heart pounded not just in his chest, but in his skull, his veins, every fiber of his being vibrating with the unbearable tension of the cursed melody. He could no longer distinguish between the living and the dead. The spectral figures of the past, those who had vanished 50 years ago, had fully merged with the students of today, their translucent forms swirling in a dance of death, their faces locked in eternal anguish. Their voices, faint but growing stronger with each passing moment, began to hum along with the music, a dissonant chorus of despair that mingled with the tormented cries of those still living. The walls of the ballroom undulated, and through the shifting shadows, Daniel saw something that froze what little remained of his soul. The floor beneath him began to crack, thin fissures snaking outward, glowing with a sickly, otherworldly light. From those cracks, long, bony hands emerged, clawing their way out of the very ground. Hands that belonged not to the dead, but to things far older, far more terrible than death itself. The veil between their world and the void beyond had fully torn. And through that veil, ancient horrors crawled. From the cracks in the floor, grotesque, formless creatures began to rise, beings of shadow and madness, their shapes impossible to define, their presence a violation of reality itself. They moved with a fluidity that defied physics, slithering and twisting in ways that made Daniel's mind reel. Their touch, should they reach him, would be the end of all reason, of all existence. Daniel's gaze locked with one of these creatures, its formless mass shifting as it slithered closer, its void-like eyes boring into him. There was no mercy in those eyes, no recognition of human suffering, only a bottomless hunger, an insatiable desire to consume everything that was, is, and would ever be. His body continued to dance, but his mind began to slip further into madness. He could no longer feel his legs or arms. They moved autonomously, obeying the ancient rhythm that now governed them all. His vision blurred, and the edges of his perception wavered as though reality itself was dissolving around him, fading into the same void from which these horrors had emerged. But in the midst of that chaos, a singular thought pierced the fog of his crumbling sanity. A thought so absurd, so irrational, that it was almost laughable. What if he could stop the music? The thought flickered like a dying candle in his mind, but it was there. The music was the key. It had always been. The cursed waltz, the conductor, the dance, everything hinged on that infernal melody. If he could find a way to stop it, to break the cycle, perhaps there was a chance to escape the fate that had claimed the others. But how? How could he stop something that had been set in motion long before he was even born? Something that was not of this world? As his mind scrambled for an answer, the conductor's voice slithered back into his thoughts, a dark, mocking whisper. You think you can defy the eternal symphony? You think you can resist the will of the abyss? Daniel's heart pounded harder. His body continued to move, but his mind, his soul, was teetering on the edge of oblivion. He had to act. He had to find a way to sever the connection between the music and the nightmare that had engulfed them. But time was running out. The cracks in the floor widened, and more of the ancient horrors emerged, their twisted forms closing in on the dancers, their presence warping the very fabric of reality. And as Daniel's gaze fell once more upon the piano, its keys glistening with the blood of his failed attempt, he knew, deep down, that whatever hope remained, however slim, lay within that instrument. The question was, would he survive long enough to find it? The horrors surrounding Daniel were no longer creatures, they were manifestations of the void, the very embodiment of chaos and entropy. The ballroom, once a grand relic of forgotten times, had become a gateway, a threshold into the infinite madness that lay beyond the fragile veil of human perception. The air hummed with dark energy, the rhythm of the music now woven into the very fabric of existence. Daniel's body, enslaved by the cursed waltz, continued its mindless dance, but his mind, his last bastion of free will, sought desperately for an answer. The conductor loomed before him, its grotesque form swelling with malignant power, as if feeding on the despair of the dancers. The music thrummed louder, faster, a relentless surge that threatened to consume all sense of time and space. But Daniel's thoughts, despite the maddening cacophony, clung to the piano. The instrument that had started it all, the key to breaking the cycle. His gaze locked on the ivory keys, now slick with crimson, and an idea took root, fragile but stubborn. He had failed once to silence the cursed melody by force, but what if the melody itself could be altered? The conductor's voice slithered through his thoughts again, a mocking whisper. You are but a note in this eternal composition, mortal. There is no escape. There is no end. But Daniel resisted the pull of the voice, clinging to the thread of sanity that remained. With every fiber of his will, he fought against the rhythm that controlled his body, forcing his feet to stumble, his arms to falter. It was agonizing, like moving through thick, suffocating tar, but slowly, inch by inch, he dragged himself toward the piano. The ancient horrors watched with dispassionate interest, their void-like eyes following his every struggle. The other dancers, those still alive, were beyond saving, their bodies twisted in grotesque contortions, their minds long consumed by the conductor's will. They would dance until there was nothing left of them, until their souls were swallowed by the abyss. But Daniel could still act. The moment he reached the piano, his fingers trembled as they hovered over the blood-stained keys. His body was shaking, barely able to resist the overpowering pull of the dance. The music roared in his ears, its dark melody digging deeper into his mind, trying to snuff out any spark of defiance. But Daniel pressed down on the keys. The first notes were jarring, discordant, cutting through the cursed waltz like a jagged knife. The conductor recoiled, its towering form rippling with surprise and anger. The shadows that had consumed the ballroom trembled, and for the briefest of moments, the endless dance faltered. Daniel pressed harder, his fingers finding a rhythm of their own, one that clashed violently with the ancient melody that bound them all. Each note he struck was wrong, deliberately out of tune, a challenge to the very order the conductor sought to impose. The air grew thick with tension, the unseen force binding his body threatening to tear him apart, but he continued, each dissonant chord unraveling the delicate balance of the infernal symphony. The conductor screamed, not in sound, but in pure, unfiltered rage that rattled the foundations of reality itself. The ballroom shook violently, the walls warping and twisting, as if the building itself was trying to tear free from the oppressive force that held it. But the more Daniel played, the more the ballroom deteriorated. The once gleaming chandeliers shattered, raining glass and shadow. The spectral dancers flickered like dying flames, their grotesque forms momentarily returning to the confused, terrified expressions of the living. And the creatures, the horrors from the void, howled in agony, their formless shapes dissolving into nothingness as the music twisted into a chaotic spiral of sound. The cracks in the floor widened, and through them, Daniel glimpsed something far worse than the creatures that had crawled forth. It was the void itself, a vast, infinite chasm of blackness, hungering for all things, ready to devour the last remnants of this world. But instead of pulling them in, the void seemed to retreat, collapsing under the weight of the discordant melody Daniel had created. The conductor shrieked again, its form unraveling, its power disintegrating under the strain of the shattered symphony. And then, with one final, discordant note, the music stopped. For a moment, all was silent. The oppressive weight of the ballroom lifted, and the air felt thin, cold, like the stillness before a storm. Daniel collapsed to the floor, his limbs weak and trembling, his mind barely able to process what had just happened. The ballroom was no longer a twisted nightmare, but a crumbling ruin, a shadow of its former self. The walls were cracked, the floor littered with debris, and the chandelier lay in pieces around him. The other students lay motionless on the ground, their bodies still, though whether they were dead or simply unconscious, Daniel couldn't tell. The spectral figures from the past had vanished, leaving only faint whispers in the air. But the conductor, what remained of it, stood at the center of the room, its form reduced to a twisted shadow of its former glory. It no longer loomed or commanded, but instead writhed and shrank, its power drained, its essence fading into the darkness from which it had come. Daniel rose to his feet, unsteady but free from the cursed waltz. His body ached, his mind reeled, but he had done it. He had broken the symphony. He had ended the nightmare. Or so he thought. As he stumbled toward the exit, he glanced back at the piano. The keys were still smeared with blood, and the room still echoed faintly with the remnants of the infernal melody. And then, he saw it, one last flicker of movement. The conductor, though nearly defeated, had not fully vanished. It lingered, a shadow of its former self, and as it stared at Daniel with its void-like gaze, a single, chilling whisper echoed in his mind. The music never truly stops. And as Daniel stepped through the doors of the ballroom, leaving the ruins behind, he could still hear, faintly in the distance, the haunting melody of the dance. The eternal symphony was not dead. It had merely paused. For now. The end.